And it was right at this moment where I thought, oofda, this one isn't going to end well.
Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you can't already tell, I am not in Jamaica anymore, unfortunately. Back home in northeastern Illinois. Came back to some bitter cold air and some snow. It's actually still snowing right now. Uh, but the only good thing about snow is you get to go plow that snow. And at my house, there's only one rule. After you get done warming up the four-wheeler, got to make sure it's really warmed up by doing some donuts in the driveway. If I do ever get married and have kids, the youngins are definitely going to get taught the same way. But anyways, let's start talking about the Saint Joseph Peninsula flight. This flight happened during the same trip to Panama City Beach back in April of 2024. If you already saw in the intro, this landing did end in a faceplant, unfortunately. So I'm mostly going to be focusing on the launch, landing, and the conditions that were going on during this flight that helped contribute to this unfortunate landing. There were definitely other really cool parts of this flight, especially when I got up to the tip of St. Joseph Peninsula. I'll make a separate video of just those clips that show the cooler parts of it. This one's more going to be focused on the educational side of things and trying to learn from what happened on this particular flight. So without further ado, let's start diving into this one.
First, let's familiarize ourselves with the geography of St. Joseph's Peninsula. This is a very long and skinny stretch of land that juts out from the Florida panhandle into the Gulf Coast. It's mostly beaches and sand dunes, but this unique geography did contribute to some very unique conditions during the flight. So the place where I took off from was roughly the midpoint of the peninsula, where I flew to the tip and back. In case you were not aware, this is not a legal flying site technically. I did mention this in the Panama City Beach flight that you cannot legally fly paramotors from any Florida state park, which St. Joe's Peninsula is a part of a Florida state park. It is a $75 fine if you are caught. Fortunately, I did get let off with just a warning from the forest rangers that approached me after I landed. So I would recommend not trying to fly from this site for that reason. Another reason why St. Joe's Peninsula is not the greatest flying site is because if you look at a sectional chart, you'll notice that it is located inside of a restricted airspace for military use only. I did note this before I took flight, and I actually called Tyndall Air Force Base a couple days prior. I spoke with somebody in charge of the airspace, and I did get permission from the Air Force Base to fly my paramotor. I gave them the times I planned to fly, the altitudes, and they did grant me permission. So now let's talk a bit about the weather conditions that were going on during this flight. The night prior, the winds were projected to be out of the northwest at about 5 to 10 miles an hour. However, by the time I got there, midday, around 11 a.m., the winds had shifted out of the northeast. So if you are already a paramotor pilot or somebody who flies, you might look at this and already kind of know what's going on weather-wise. But if you don't, that's okay because we're about to talk about turbulence. So when you're flying a paramotor, turbulence is not your friend. And on this flight, I was dealing with two different types of turbulence, thermal turbulence and rotary turbulence. The rotary turbulence is more in the launch and landings, so we'll focus on that second. First, let's talk about the thermal turbulence that I was experiencing. So, as I had mentioned, the winds were supposed to be out of the northwest, which would have been very ideal because you would have had the winds coming off of the coast and onto the peninsula, and I would not have had thermal turbulence really even during the middle of the day because of it coming over the water. Water does not heat the same way that land does, and it should have been a lot smoother air. However, since the winds had shifted out of the northeast and they're blowing over the peninsula, I did get some pockets of thermals that were coming up and giving me some bumps and turbulence. You can't really see it in the GoPro footage that clearly, but I am getting rocked by thermals. I can definitely feel them coming up off of this strip of land, and it wasn't the most comfortable ride up to the tip. However, once I did get to the tip of the peninsula, it was very smooth air. Because you didn't have all that land heating up and giving you turbulence to deal with. For easy reference, here's a quick visual of the two different types of thermals that you could experience. the smaller bubble type thermals and the larger big thermal columns. What I was experiencing was definitely the left side image where it was just the bubble type thermals. It wasn't that bad of turbulence to where I felt like I was going to take any severe collapses. It was just an uncomfortable ride alongside the peninsula. So you might be wondering why I didn't just fly on the east side of the peninsula where it should have been much smoother air. The reason being, if you can't tell by the video, there's not much beaches over there on that side. So if I did have to make an emergency landing, I'd have to get back over to the other side, and I would have rather not risked it. Given the severity of the turbulence, I'd rather stay on the west side of the island where I'd have a very easy emergency landing opportunity if I needed it. As I mentioned earlier, the other type of turbulence I dealt with on this flight is the rotary turbulence, which played more of a role during the launch and landing. Here's a quick visual of what I'm talking about when I say rotary turbulence. It's just the turbulence we get when the wind passes over any solid object and interacts with features on the ground. So in this example, it's just wind blowing over the roof of a house, and on the downstream side of the wind, you get these eddies that form where it's just rotation in the air that kind of curls downwards towards the ground and then curves back up. This is the kind of turbulence that I hit when I was coming in for my landing as it was passing over the trees and the sand dunes. So let's keep all that in mind as we go and look closer at the launch and landing of this flight. Right here, you can see that shortly after my wing pops up, it wants to turn to the right or into the wind, which is natural for paragliding wings. So I did have to correct a bit for this crosswind launch. And right here, you can see that little cloud of sand pop up right behind my propeller as I thought I was getting off the ground, but evidently I wasn't when I decided to pick up my feet. So I did sink down a little bit. My prop did strike the sand, and that is due to that rotary turbulence. I must have caught a little bit of a downdrift from the interaction between the air and the ground, and so I did get a little bit of a sand blast in my prop. So as I'm coming for this landing, just note how my wing is still oscillating back and forth a bit. This is due to the thermal turbulence I was experiencing up high as I was trying to set up for this approach. I had a very narrow section of beach that I was trying to land on, and the thermals were not making it easy for me. So as I'm coming down, I'm transitioning from that thermal turbulence that's rocking me back and forth a bit to that rotary turbulence near the ground, which we will see here in a bit. Due to those wing oscillations and the turbulence I was feeling, it felt like I hit a bit of a downdraft and was coming at the ground a bit faster than I would have been on a normal approach. So right here is where I come down to about shoulder height with my hands on the brake toggles to start my flare. And right here you can see my wing pitched back as I exited that column of sink that I felt like I was getting into. I'd already started my flare and I had started to raise back up. You can kind of see my hands go back up a bit more, which is a big no-no when you're going in for your landing. Once you start your flare and you pull some brake, if you let back up on that brake too much, your wing is going to shoot over your head and throw you right into the ground. So I did have to quickly adjust. And at this point, I had to continue with my flare, and I am fully flared at this point with my hands down by my hips. This is really my only option, even though I kept going back up a bit further away from the ground. Continuing that flare and slowing down your ground speed did help make this landing as soft as it possibly could have been. The wing did eventually overshoot me and push me into the ground, as we can see right here. So what are some of the key takeaways from this flight? First thing is don't be afraid to change your plans, especially as weather conditions change. Unfortunately, the smartest decisions and the most fun decisions are usually not the same thing. As soon as I saw that the conditions had changed from what I thought they'd be, I knew that I was going to be in for a rough flight and I would have some challenges ahead of me. However, I did drive almost 2 hours from our Airbnb to get here just to fly, so I wasn't about to say, nope, never mind, I think I'm going to stay on the ground. I assessed the risk, I realized it was still flyable, but given my skill level and my experience, I knew it was going to be an interesting flight. I don't regret flying on this day, but it would have been smarter to stay on the ground, I will admit that. Number two, never stop practicing your kiting. The best thing that you can do on a day that's too windy to fly is to go get your wing and a kiting harness and just go out in the field and practice keeping the wing above your head. Especially if you're somewhere that has trees and might be causing some rotary turbulence, well, that's a perfect opportunity to start learning how to react to that rotary turbulence and to correct the wing to keep it above your head. It'll make you a smarter, safer pilot, make you more familiar with your wing, and learn your wing a lot better. Every wing is different. For example, in my landing that we saw here, I had the brake toggles pulled down all the way for a fairly long time, but the wing did not fall back and stall. It wanted to keep flying. That's because I'm flying a more beginner-friendly wing that is more forgiving to severe brake inputs like that, but a more advanced glider might fall back and stall and you would fall out of the sky a bit quicker. Every wing is different. Learn it on the ground before you get in the sky. Number three, practice flying in turbulent conditions in familiar places first. I will admit I did not have all that much turbulent flying experience prior to this flight. This was probably not the best time to learn on a beach with a bunch of people looking at you. So if you get to practice flying in turbulent conditions that you know is manageable in familiar places first, that will aid you greatly in nailing launches and landings when you might feel you're under a bit more pressure in a newer environment. I've practiced launches and landings in turbulent conditions since this flight, and I can't say I've had any more face plants like this, so practice definitely does go a long way. You might be wondering how I fared after this faceplant experience. Did I hurt myself at all or sustain any injuries? Well, I'll just let the GoPro audio play out for this landing, and it should explain itself.
Good? Yeah, I'm good. Probably just a little hurt.
And there you have it. My only injury was my pride, which is the best kind of injury you can ask for in the sport of paramotoring.